Man is by nature a social animal whose inclination it is to live in the company of others. Man is by nature a political animal. These are famous views of Aristotle's, that we are by nature social, that we are by nature political, and that there's something in us that compels us to live in society with others. Now, Aristotle also notes that we're not alone in this respect. After all, bees and swans are social animals. There's a very strong tendency throughout the animal kingdom for affiliative modes of life, living in flocks, in prides, living in herds, in schools. We have this tendency, which I say is widespread in the animal kingdom, to put ourselves into groups, collectives, communities. Now, in light of Aristotle's approach to knowledge and understanding, we're not surprised that the question arising from this fact is the what is it for variety? What are such groupings for? What's the whole point of it, we might say? What is the logos that seems to govern these affiliative tendencies? Not only do we have a tendency to group ourselves together, but it also seems that we don't let it stop at the level of tribal enclaves or small familial ensembles. Whenever there are favoring circumstances, there seems to be a movement very much in the direction of the forming of a polis, a state of some kind. And this raises a very interesting question. Why should this tendency to live in the company of others ever move beyond the stage of families? What purpose is being served by more complex modes of social and ultimately political life? Now, Aristotle notes that you cannot form a polis with one person, and by the time there are 100,000 people, there's no polis at all. Indeed, we might pause to reflect on the possibility that in this Aristotle may be right, in which case we may well have ceased to be a political community not long after the arrival of the Mayflower. But obviously what he has in mind with this claim is that there is some right or ideal population which, if greatly exceeded, prevents the very aims of a polis from being realized, thus removing the community out of the class of bona fide poles. At issue is the relationship between population and the preservation of a recognizable political community. In 20th century political terms, we might say that all politics is local, and that already is reaching down to a more manageable numerical entity. Well, to the question then, why do we ever go beyond small tribal enclaves, you might answer, well, there's safety in numbers. But as Aristotle notes, you do not need a political community for that. He points out, for example, that pirates have no trouble defending themselves, and indeed pirates have no trouble engaging in trade. Lawless communities can do the same sort of thing. So there really isn't any good evidence to suggest that you need no less than a political form of life for self-defense. And indeed, political communities are defeated left and right. Nor does a utilitarian notion of trade and commerce quite do, because trade indeed can be conducted within vanishingly small tribal enclaves and in only quasi-political settings. So there must be something about the polis that serves a purpose that cannot otherwise be served, that brings something about and realizes a potentiality that otherwise would lie dormant and would atrophy as a result of disuse or neglect. What then are the grounds of social affiliation, if not just self-defense, commerce, or utility? We begin our search for an answer in Aristotle's two major ethical writings, the Nicomachean Ethics and the Eudemian Ethics. There is some controversy still existing as to which of these is to be taken as the more complete and developed version of the other. I should think the majority of scholars would regard the Nicomachean Ethics as Aristotle's more developed position on matters ethical, and the Eudemian Ethics as an earlier and less complete work. But we can consider the merits of the arguments within these works without binding our judgment to Aristotle's own. Furthermore, there is substantial agreement and even total repetition of major propositions that can be found in the two works. In these works, Aristotle examines the nature of that most basic form of social affiliation, friendship. And I think if we pause to consider Aristotle on friendship, it will prove to be a useful introduction to his understanding of social cohesion and political affiliation in general. Friendship, says Aristotle, comes in different forms and serves different purposes. Some friendships are grounded solely in considerations of pleasure. That is, A befriends B and B befriends A because in each other's company some essentially sensual pleasure is derived. Now, Aristotle is not priggish on this point. You might recall that H.L. Mencken once defined Puritanism as, quote, the haunting feeling that someone somewhere may be happy. Aristotle is not opposed to people being happy. He's not opposed to friendships being grounded in pleasure, including sensual pleasure, pleasures of the moment even. He simply notes that to the extent that this is the grounding of a friendship, the friendship will survive only as long as the pleasure does. And it does seem to be in the nature of things that pleasures of that kind have an ephemeral quality about them. Nonetheless, it is one of the grounds of friendship, and indeed quite a common grounding. As with all such pleasures, these too might be addictive, such that one looks no further for the possibilities in a relationship other than sensual pleasure. Now, there are friendships with a different foundation, those that are based on utility. A befriends B and B befriends A because A and B are useful to each other. We meet not far from Washington, D.C., which is one of the world's centers of networking. Well, networking and utility go hand in glove. Who can gainsay the importance of associations that do serve some useful end? Aristotle is not devoting himself to lessons in uselessness or disutility. But again, he does note that the survival of a relationship of that kind can't go much beyond the time when A and B cease to be useful to each other. So these pragmatic or practical groundings of friendship more or less date the friendships and also establish terms of friendship that, shall we say, could be served by almost anybody else who came along at the right time with the right resources and proved to be just as useful, in which event A would leave B and associate as a friend of C because C is now more useful. Such friendships needn't be either heartless nor headless, but they are in the end entirely self-regarding. A's friendship is not for the sake of B, nor is B's for the sake of A. In each instance, the friendship is selfishly motivated, but caters to the self-interests of each party. But then Aristotle says there is a third class of friendship, which he identifies with the Greek expression teleia philia. I'm almost tempted to refuse to translate this, because English may not render its meaning with fullness. Teleia philia is usually translated as completed or perfected friendship. Teleia is etymologically related to telos, the goal or end or plan of something. But the adjective teleos often qualifies its noun as something fully developed, or in some contexts as spotless. Now, in qualifying a friendship this way, one would mean not just the fully developed form of friendship, but a development that completes the intended design or purpose of the thing that is now completely developed. Teleia philia, completed or perfected friendship. Well, in what is this grounded? If we intend the expression to convey a species of friendship that expresses the end or purpose served by human associations, then we, or surely Aristotle, will see the grounding of this form of friendship as virtue itself. In such friendships, there is a sharing by the friends of a set of values and principles of an essentially and irreducibly moral nature. In this kind of friendship, what A wants for B is what is good for B for the sake of B. And what B wants for A is what is good for A for the sake of A. That is, you want what is good for your friend's sake. There isn't anything self-regarding about this. Now, what we find in a friendship of this kind is a constructive relationship in which each friend, in virtue of his own qualities, helps to realize ever more fully what is not only potentially in the other, but also realized in the other, and now revered and honored in the other, and thus sustained, promoted, encouraged, nurtured, celebrated. These are the friendships of a lifetime. They exist in virtue of the fact that they conduce to goodness itself, understood as moral excellence, or in the Greek, arete. Aristotle argues that this kind of friendship is available not to the many, and in fact, in much of Aristotle's writing on subjects of this kind, the subjects of interest are what in the Greek are called the kaloi kagathoi. Now, what is a kalos kagathos? The translation of that I think amuses me most is where kalos kagathos is translated as a, quote, gentleman, which sounds very much like all you have to do is go to a good men's club in London and you'll find any number of kaloi kagathoi. Gentlemen in this sense know the proper modes of both dress and address. We would expect the kaloi kagathoi to be gentlemen, of course, but they'd be much more than this. Much more like chivalric knights, maybe even knights of the Round Table. In other words, Aristotle is talking about a quite exceptional pairing of human beings of a very special stripe. He's insisting that teleophilia is not the common form of friendship. Now, this claim raises a serious problem. In contending that this form of friendship obtains only among the few who are equally worthy, well, some have concluded that there would be too few of such beings to constitute a polis. Now, if a polis is, as Aristotle thinks it is, a community of friends, and if the right sort of friendship is rare and obtains only between equals, well, it looks like the candidate polis is going to be a nearly empty place. There isn't going to be anybody in it. What you will have there perhaps will be Mother Teresa and 2 or 3 of her nuns, that sort of thing. So some have argued that by the time you do sort the moral arithmetic of Aristotle's ethics and political writings and get to the polis, there's no one there. Now, I believe this problematic conclusion is based on a misunderstanding of Aristotle's sense of equality. He does indeed declare that for teleophilia to obtain between two people, there has to be some kind of equality between them. But he then asks as to the degree of inequality that would render the relationship impossible. How unequal would two beings have to be for this kind of friendship to be impossible? He says the inequality would have to be of the sort that obtains between mortals and the gods. It would have to be a profound and essential inequality. Clearly, the equality that Aristotle is getting at is an apt or proportionate equality, and I think this requires an illustration. So let's do it this way. One goes to the Metropolitan Opera, and on the right night and for the right opera, where the production is in place, the cast is well rehearsed, and the spirit moves them all. Here one will find several hours of absolute sublimity. Now, let's say that the sublimity is courtesy of, Leontine Price, or Kiri te Kanawa, or Pavarotti. Well, the audience can't sing the arias, obviously, and so there's no quantitative equality between those sitting in the seats and those singing on the stage. But those singing on the stage are singing to a refined and cultivated, appreciative audience who have studied and learned enough about music and have entered empathetically and sympathetically into the production so as to become part of the performance itself. The audience is an essential part of the entire affair. Now, this is not just sound in an empty room any longer. And of course, the singers and the musicians have spent a lifetime perfecting their art so that they can translate the music and the words of those now long dead into something that will be responded to in the right way by this audience. So here we find a proportionate equality. The singers have a talent that is appreciated by the audience in virtue of the audience's good taste and aesthetic breeding. The audience greatly admires the wonderful performances on the stage, wonderful in virtue of the life of discipline and devotion that has been lived by the performers. Now here I speak again only metaphorically. Here you've got the possibility, in the metaphorical sense now, of tilea philia, not in that the people in the audience can sing like Pavarotti, but in the sense that there is a mutual respect. Each of the participants understands what is best and good in the other, and wants what is best and good for the other's sake. Now, if we understand it that way, you could constitute a polis without people being quantitatively equal to each other in the matter of virtue. I don't think there's anything in Aristotle at the political or ethical level that is unrealistic. He was far too clever to have put together a program in ethics and politics that could not possibly be realized in practice. And when we say that the possibility of a completed or perfected friendship is brought about as a result of the virtue that flourishes in the participants in this friendship, the question naturally arises as to what we mean by virtue. Virtue on Aristotle's account is to be understood in two different senses. That is, excellence itself, arete, is to be understood in two different senses. They complement each other, but they're distinguishable. There are, after all, the intellectual virtues. There is something to be said for intellectual excellence as it reveals itself in scientific knowledge, in that deep intuitive knowledge that is the gift of rationality itself, as in great artistic ability, technique, which the great sculptors and painters have. These are virtues or excellences that are important. They're central to creative life. But then there are the moral virtues, the moral excellences. And Aristotle has to give us a definition of these. What are they like? How do we know it when we're dealing with something that is a moral virtue? Paraphrasing Aristotle, we might reach the following position. First, in the matter of the intellectual virtues, these are not innate. They come about by way of teaching, practice, and discipline. Now, some people are going to learn much, much more and more quickly than others. But no one is a great sculptor at birth. You might have great potentialities at birth that someone else might not have. But technique is something that is acquired. You go to school. People teach you how to do it. You watch great people do it, and you try to mimic what they've done. Now, as these intellectual virtues come about by learning, the moral virtues come about by habit. Aristotle says quite specifically, quote, "The moral virtues are not innate." Well, that's it. That's a categorical statement. Indeed, as the intellectual virtues, the intellectual excellences, are earned in the classroom and on the classroom stool, so to speak, the moral virtues are essentially acquired through habitual forms of activity. Here we see receding the old Platonic view, borrowed from Hesiod, of men of gold, men of silver, men of brass, and men of iron. Aristotle does not offer innate intuitions possessed by a soul that becomes wiser with successive incarnations. No, offered instead is a thesis that is rather more functionalist, commonsensical, earthbound. I don't want to say that Aristotle ever departs fully from his own teachers, or from the academy at large. But we certainly see here a program of research, a program of scholarship that is very much directed at the world as we observe it. It's based on wide experience. How do people come about knowing things? For goodness sake, they learn in school. How do people come to reflect virtuous behavior? By being held, by being reined in childhood, brought up in the right way, given good examples to follow, and practicing 7 days a week being better than you were the day before. That's how it comes about. Obviously, you've got to have something in there to start with. There's going to be the usual elitist hereditarian element in Aristotle's teaching too. But all that said, practice and rehearsal and exercise and discipline finally conduce to what Aristotle calls the habit of virtue. A point is reached when it's like bicycle riding. You are no longer thinking step by step, do I put this foot down, do I put this foot down? And the person of virtue, the person who has developed virtue in the habitual sense, is no longer saying, should I do the right thing, should I do the wrong thing? This person now is living a form of life that just is a virtuous form of life. But this again returns us to the question, well, what is a virtue? First, it is a disposition. It is an inclination or disposition to act in a certain way, to act towards certain ends and away from other ends. Now, the ancient Greek for disposition is hexis, and the plural would be hexes. Now, suppose we take a characteristic, let's take an emotion such as anger. Is anger good or bad? Should one ever be angry? This is an example from Aristotle. Remember, anger is the first word in Homer's Iliad, menein. The entire epic is about rage and anger and the passions. Now, Aristotle's position on the emotions is what you might expect from this great naturalist and biologist and common sense psychologist. Nature has fitted us out with these emotions. Nature does nothing without a purpose. Obviously, it would be preposterous to claim that some set of emotions characteristic of the entire human race is somehow immoral or pathological. So the question is the wrong question when you ask, is anger good or bad? The right question is, what is it that one should be disposed to be angry toward? That is, what should be your inclination or disposition toward anger? Now, to become angry when one has been treated unjustly is to have what Aristotle would call a good hexis for anger. But to become angry when virtue triumphs over vice is to have a bad hexis for anger. Of course, Aristotle distinguishes between anger and rage. Rage is a perversion of an emotion that is otherwise a natural supplement and complement to human life. Rage, as the extremity to which unchecked anger extends, becomes such a controlling factor that there's no possibility for a rational course of action at all. And this gives us a clue as to what Aristotle takes the virtues to be. The virtues are invariably the midpoint between two extremes. The extremes are the extremes of vice. The virtue is the midpoint between an extreme deficiency and an extreme excess. What is it the hero has? The hero has the virtue of courage. Now, what is an extreme defect of courage? Cowardice. And what is an extreme excess on that continuum on which we find courage? Well, the extreme excess is heedlessness. So between the extremes of heedlessness and cowardice is that midpoint, that golden mean, you see. Aristotle's golden mean, that rock solid, well, not rock solid because we do vary a bit around the midpoint. The midpoint is that element of proportionality again, that Pythagorean element, that Hellenic element, nothing to excess, metron, ariston, the middle course is best. It shows up in sculpture, it shows up in the Acropolis itself, in the paintings, in the mathematics, the music, the dance, the drama. It's always opposing excess. It's always promoting the reasonable, the harmonic, the mathematically pure. The goal is a perfectionist goal. The goal is getting it right. And of course, we are of several natures, passionate, rational, willful. The task of virtue is in getting the blend right and seeing to it that the ordinance of reason is dispository. It controls and regulates everything else, and the passions centrally. Well, it turns out that those who are fit to rule are really those who are fit for friendship. They are persons of virtue. They are persons capable of moderation and prudence, the moral virtues in general. Now we're ready to return to the question as to why we enter into political forms of social affiliation. Yes, we are by nature social animals whose inclination it is to live in the company of others. Now, why the polis? Aristotle makes an interesting claim in the Politics. The claim he makes is that in the order of things, the polis precedes the family and the individual. Now, this sounds inverted, to be sure. The polis precedes the family and the individual. How could this possibly be? It must be a misprint. Not so. Aristotle is a great biologist. Obviously for him, the polis does not precede the family in the sense of family as a breeding pool. It does not precede in the order of time. If all one meant by family is a kind of hereditary relatedness, then of course you have that without any kind of political community at all. But surely that isn't what one means by family. Because if that's what one meant by family, you could never have an adopted son or daughter. What one means by family is finally a pattern of obligations and duties, the obligations that parents have to children, children have to parents, the power to dispose of property, to pass it on through wills, to accumulate estates, to engage in familial modes of activity. But all this presupposes an essentially political form of life. Obligations and duties are brought about within the polis. So to have the family in that developed sense of family, at least some minimal form of political community is necessary. Now what about the individual? To say that the polis precedes the individual cannot refer to events in the order of time. But what do we mean by the individual? If all we mean by an individual is a body, let's even say a living body, then obviously you need nothing of a polis nor family for that. All the family members might have died and just left one survivor. But when we start talking about George or Jack or Jane or Mary, what terms do we use? Well, we say mother, father, brother, sister, daughter, cousin, teacher, plumber, etc., etc. What are these designations? They're designations that come about within an essentially political community, identifying certain tasks and responsibilities, obligations, duties, and the like. And contractual terms, terms of marriage, terms of condemnation. The individual is defining himself. Antigone defining herself as the loving sister of Polynices, Odysseus as husband of Penelope. These identifications of the individual, these things that give the individual a personal identity, are inextricably bound up with familial and political life. And absent that familial and political life, there is only that most deplorable form of life described by Homer. About whom does Homer say this is the worst imaginable life? It is the life of the hearthless, stateless, lawless man. So Aristotle is recovering again this Homeric sense that a flourishing life presupposes a political form of affiliation. A rich, indeed, a kind of life entered into by those prepared to live together at the level of principle and live together in friendly relationships, rich in that sense, robust. And friendly relationships, if they are to serve the very purposes of friendship itself, presuppose a commitment to virtue. Virtuous actions are those performed by the virtuous person. And again, this is a supposition sometimes misunderstood when discussing Aristotle. Consider this case. Suppose Jones is in a state of post-hypnotic suggestion and goes over and helps someone who has fallen down a well. When Jones is then awakened from hypnotic slumber and asked what he just did, he has no recollection of doing it at all. Now, we can all agree that it's a nice thing to help someone who has fallen into a well. But we certainly wouldn't say that the person who provided that help engaged in virtuous behavior because the person who provided that help didn't know what he was doing in the first place. So in order to declare an activity to be virtuous, it has to be done by a certain kind of person. It has to be done intentionally by someone who is developed in the habits of virtue. And so Aristotle wants to make clear that to identify something as virtuous is already to identify the actor as a certain kind of person. Virtuous actions are done by virtuous people. Mobs are not virtuous. Mobs are passionate. That's what mob rule is all about. And mobs can tyrannize over the virtuous because the tastes of the mob are generally grounded in considerations of pleasure and utility. Mob rule does not constitute the grounds of a perfected friendship. So again we find Aristotle, although not to the same extent at all as we found in Plato, we find in Aristotle a certain suspiciousness about radical forms of democratic rule, a recognition that it's the kaloi kagathoi who really have to run the game. and that perhaps the best mode of political life is some kind of constitutional monarchy, where the rule of law is determinative, but where those who are in charge of administering that law function as friends.